The historian's task was simple. Read humanity's wars, measure how dangerous they are. She started with their bloodiest century, the one with two world wars and weapons that split the atom. And what she found wasn't humanity's ferocity. It was humanity's restraint. In every war, at every moment, humans had access to something worse and chose not to use it. They stopped short. They pulled punches. They signed treaties banning their own best weapons. Every horror in human history, she realized, was humanity fighting with one hand tied behind its back on purpose. And she was left with one question that kept her awake. What happens the day they decide to stop holding back? This isn't fiction. It's the conclusion of a coalition of alien historians who spent decades studying Earth's entire military record. They expected to find a race of savage conquerors. Instead, they uncovered a pattern so disturbing that it's now classified at the highest level. Because if humanity has never fought at full strength, one question defines the future of every species in the galaxy. Dr. Valeria Kesh had spent 200 cycles studying the military histories of 17 galactic species. She had seen wars of extinction, wars of ideology, wars over resources so scarce they made planets crumble. None of them prepared her for Earth. She was the lead analyst of the Coalition's Threat Assessment Division. Her job was simple: read a species' wars and predict their future behavior. Dangerous species received sanctions. Overly aggressive ones got containment protocols. Peaceful ones got trade agreements. Humanity was a fresh find, discovered in a frontier sector 20 years ago. Their technology was primitive, but their radio chatter was alarming. So the Coalition sent Kesh to study them before first contact protocols were finalized. Kesh began with humanity's most destructive century, the 20th, two world wars, a Cold War that nearly ignited global annihilation, proxy conflicts on every continent. She compiled every battle, every weapon deployed, every casualty. But the numbers didn't add up. In the Second World War, humans had stockpiled chemical and biological agents capable of killing millions in hours. They manufactured nerve gases, weaponized anthrax, perfected delivery systems that could blanket entire cities. They were ready to unleash them, but they didn't. The Germans, who pioneered these horrors, held back. The British, who wargamed scenarios for gassing the English Channel if invaded, held back. The Americans, who developed enough chemical weapons to poison half of Europe, held back. Everyone had their reasons. Fear of retaliation, treaty obligations, some even citing morality. But Kesh had studied enough species to know that morality rarely survives existential threat. And yet humanity, in the most desperate war in its history, kept its worst weapons caged. Then the Cold War. For 40 years, humanity stood at the brink. They built bombs that could vaporize cities, missiles that could cross oceans in minutes, arsenals that could destroy all life on Earth many times over. They came within a hair's breadth of nuclear exchange at least 5 times. And each time someone blinked. A Soviet officer overrode a false alarm. An American president refused a launch order. They created hotlines, arms control treaties, even a cultural taboo against using these weapons. Kesh had never seen a species so terrified of its own power, and yet so disciplined in not using it. It was as if they were training themselves to resist their own instincts. But the real shock came when she traced the pattern backwards. This wasn't a modern aberration. It was a constant across human history. As far back as ancient Greece, they banned the use of poison on the battlefield. In medieval Europe, they forbade certain crossbows. They signed treaties to limit weapons of mass destruction before such weapons even existed in any practical form. Time and time again, humans invented ways to kill each other, then immediately invented reasons not to use them. Kesh cross-referenced against her own species' history. Her people, the Cathari, had developed nuclear fission during a unification war. They used it without hesitation. They wiped out their rival faction in a single afternoon, then spent the next 10,000 cycles congratulating themselves on their decisiveness. Other species did the same. Every known civilization that unlocked atomic power used it in war within a decade, except humans. They unlocked it in 1945, used it twice, then stopped for nearly 80 years and counting. Even as they built enough warheads to end their own civilization, they never used another one. Not once. The numbers were undeniable. In every major conflict, humanity's actual death tolls fell far short of their theoretical maximum. If they deployed all available force, wars could have been 10 times deadlier, sometimes 100. But they chose not to. They chose restraint. And that's when Kesh found the classified file. It wasn't a military strategy document. It wasn't a treaty or a moral sermon. It was a psychological profile authored by humans themselves, buried in their internet archives, labeled with a term that defied easy translation. We were holding back. She read on. The file argued that human violence was not merely restrained out of fear or ethics. It was restrained because of consensus. A collective, unspoken decision among leaders, generals, and even ordinary people to never fight at full capacity, not because they couldn't, but because they were afraid of what would happen if they let go. The author, a human military theorist, concluded that humanity's greatest strength wasn't its ferocity, it was its ability to hold the leash. The file ended with a chilling postscript: the leash is fraying, and then Kesh's communicator pinged. A contact she had inserted into Earth's military networks was sending a distress signal. The message was fragmented, full of static, but the words were clear enough. They know we're watching. And they're ready. The distress signal originated from an orbital relay station just outside Earth's lunar perimeter. It was there that a covert observation post, manned by a single Cathari operative code-named Rylix, had been intercepting human military communications for the past 5 years. Rylix's message was barely a whisper. "They've found me. They've known for months. They let me watch. They wanted me to report back." The signal cut to static. Kesh immediately sent an encrypted alert to Coalition Central Command. But before she could receive a response, a second transmission arrived. This one was not from Rylix. It was from an unknown source, originating inside Earth itself. The message was a single sentence in flawless galactic standard: "We are ready to discuss the terms of your observation." The Coalition's leadership went into emergency session. For the first time in 10,000 cycles, a precontact species had not only detected a covert surveillance team, but had actively manipulated the observation to deliver a message. The implication was terrifying. Either humanity had always known, or they had discovered the surveillance recently and decided to play along. Either way, the restraint Kesh had been studying was not merely a psychological quirk. It was a deliberate strategy. Kesh's report was declassified immediately and circulated to every member species. The pattern she had identified was not an anomaly. It was a signal. Every war, every unused weapon, every treaty signed was humanity announcing itself to the universe. They were not afraid of their own violence. They were choosing when and how to show it. And they had been doing it for centuries, long before they ever knew for certain that aliens were real. The restraint was a message designed to be found. And now it had been received. But the real shock came when Coalition analysts compared Kesh's historical timeline with the dates of human technological advancement. The pattern became undeniable. Every time humanity developed a weapon of mass destruction, they paused. They debated. They signed treaties. And then, during the pause, they made a leap in another field. After the atomic bomb, they invested in space exploration and computers. After biological weapons were outlawed, they revolutionized medicine. They were not simply restraining themselves. They were redirecting their energy. The restraint was not a cap on their power. It was a release valve that allowed them to advance without self-destruction. And then, one analyst noticed a detail that had been hiding in plain sight. Every major human weapons ban treaty contained a subtle loophole. The Geneva Protocol banned the first use of chemical and biological weapons, but not their production or stockpiling. The Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty limited the number of nuclear states, but not their refinement of second strike capability. Humanity was not disarming. They were optimizing. They were creating a world where they could fight at full strength if necessary, but only after exhausting every other option. They were building a civilization that could survive its own worst impulses, and then, if pushed, unleash hell. Kesh confronted the only human in coalition custody, a captured research scientist who had been part of a pre-contact observation mission to a Cathari colony. The human's debriefing had been uneventful until now, but when Kesh presented the pattern, the human smiled. It was not a threatening smile. It was the smile of someone who had been waiting to be asked the right question. "You figured it out," the human said. "Yes, we hold back, we have to. Because if we don't, if we ever let the leash slip, we know exactly what we'll become. We've known since we crawled out of the mud that the worst monster on this planet is the one looking back at us in the mirror. So we built a culture around keeping that monster chained." Kesh asked the question that had haunted her since the first distress signal. "What happens if the chain breaks?" The human leaned forward. "We've spent 10,000 years training ourselves to never let it break. But there's one scenario we've never had to face. Until now." The human paused. "What if we're not the ones breaking the chain? What if someone else tries to break it for us?" The realization hit Kesh like a physical blow. Humanity wasn't afraid of its own violence. It was afraid of being pushed by an outside force into a corner so tight that restraint became impossible. They had spent their entire history managing themselves. But no one, not even the coalition, had ever considered what happens when a species of peace through terror faces a genuinely external threat. A threat that doesn't understand the chain. A threat that demands full force and keeps pushing until the chain snaps. Central Command issued its first contact directive within the hour, but Kesh knew it was already too late. Because while the coalition was deliberating, Earth had already sent a second message. This one was not a greeting. It was an invitation, addressed to every member species, every allied government, every being who had ever watched humanity from the shadows. "You wanted to see what we're capable of. We've been showing you for 100 years, but you've only seen the hand we keep visible. You wanted to know if we'd ever fight at full strength. There's only one way to find out. Join us, or don't. But know that the hand we keep behind our back is not empty." The message hit the coalition like a meteor strike. For 10,000 cycles, the idea that a pre-contact species could issue an ultimatum was unthinkable. But this was not a threat of war. It was a threat of honesty. Humanity had spent a century broadcasting its restraint. Now it was asking every species to make a choice. Stand with humanity and learn what it truly means to hold back, or stand against them and become the first civilization in 500 million years to see what happens when the leash snaps. Central Command went into lockdown. Ambassadors from 1,000 worlds flooded the emergency channel with demands for information. The VAR delegation, seated in their usual chamber, did not speak. They simply watched. And Kesh, reviewing the human message for the 7th time, noticed something that made her blood run cold. The phrase, "the hand we keep behind our back," was not a metaphor. It was a direct translation of a VAR wartime idiom. A phrase so specific, so rooted in the VAR's own history of clan warfare that it could not be a coincidence. Humanity had not just studied their own history, they had studied the VAR's, and they were speaking directly to them. The captured human scientist who had been watching the chaos unfold from a holding cell asked to speak with Kesh. When she arrived, the human was calm. "We knew you'd figure it out eventually," the scientist said. "Not the restraint part. The part where we've been reaching out to the one species we knew would understand. The VAR. For decades, humans had been sending encrypted signals to the VAR homeworld, using frequencies the coalition couldn't intercept. They had shared historical archives, cultural philosophy, and something else. A question. What would it take for a species like the VAR, feared and ostracized by the pacifist majority, to ally with a newcomer? The VAR had answered, and the answer was simple. Prove your worth. Prove you understand the burden of power. Prove you can hold the leash. And so humanity sent the perfect proof. Their entire history of restraint displayed like a resume. Every war they didn't escalate, every weapon they banned, every treaty they signed was not just a message to themselves. It was a message to the VAR. We are like you, only more terrifying because we choose to be less. Kesh realized the VAR delegation had not spoken because they were not surprised. They had been expecting this message for decades. The human scientist explained that the cultural exchange with the VAR was already a formality. The alliance had been sealed in secret the moment a human delegate and a VAR delegate shared a drink. What the coalition was seeing now was not an aggressive newcomer. It was the final stage of a long-planned partnership. And then, the wait, it gets worse moment. The scientist leaned in. You think our weapon stockpiles are the real threat. You think we've been holding back nukes and nerve gas. That's nothing. The real hand behind our back is our capacity for collective action. We've trained our entire species to cooperate in a crisis. If you attack an ordinary human city, you'll face a nation's military. If you attack Earth itself, you'll face all of humanity, unified for the first time in our history. We've never unified, not ever, because we've never had an external enemy. You thought our restraint was keeping our weapons under control. The real restraint was keeping ourselves from becoming a hive mind of pure focused retaliation. That's the leash. And if you break it, you won't get scattered resistance. You'll get 11 billion humans acting as a single, coordinated organism with one goal: your extinction. The coalition leadership fell into stunned silence. The human scientist continued. Every simulation we've run ends the same way. If we're pushed to the brink, we stop being individuals. We stop caring about our own survival. We allocate everything to the single task of ending the threat. We don't sleep. We don't negotiate. We don't stop until there's nothing left to threaten us. It's the ultimate expression of our hunter-gatherer past, persistence predation, but on a species-wide scale. We've never used it because we've never been existentially threatened. But now, with the VAR as our allies and the coalition having to choose sides, we might finally get the chance to demonstrate it. Or not, your move. The chamber erupted. Ambassadors screamed for preemptive strikes, containment, quarantine, but the VAR delegation rose. Their leader, the same Axion who had first met with humanity, spoke a single sentence that silenced the room. We have seen their history, we have shared their philosophy, and we will stand with them. The unthinkable had happened. The two most feared species in the galaxy were now aligned, and the coalition had to decide whether to fight an alliance that had never once fought at full strength. The leash was now in the hands of two predators who understood exactly how thin it was. The coalition did not declare war. They couldn't. The alliance between humanity and the VAR was too dangerous to provoke, and yet too stable to dismantle. For the first time in galactic history, a precontact species had not only survived first contact, but had dictated its terms. And those terms were breathtakingly simple. Humanity would join the Republic Council. The VAR would remain their ally, and the rest of the galaxy would learn, at their own pace, what it meant to live beside a predator who had mastered the art of holding back. Kesh was summoned to present her final report to the full assembly. She walked into the chamber under the gaze of 1,000 species, each one wondering if her analysis would validate their fears or soothe them. She began with the numbers. Over the course of their recorded history, humans had the capacity to kill 300% more combatants than they actually did. Their weapons stockpiles, if fully deployed, could have ended their own civilization dozens of times over. The most shocking statistic came last: the probability that an intelligent species would develop nuclear weapons, and then refrained from using them in warfare for 80 years was 0.03%. Humanity was an artificial exception. They had not just held back, they had deliberately, institutionally engineered their own restraint. The session was interrupted by a joint statement from the human and VAR delegations. John Smith, the same delegate who had first introduced humanity, now stood beside Axion of the VAR empire. They announced, in a single voice, the formation of a new compact, the Restraint Accord, not a military alliance designed to conquer, but a mutual defense and cultural exchange framework built around the principle that true strength lay in knowing when not to strike. They invited any species, large or small, to join. The only requirement was a willingness to catalog their own worst impulses and build systems to manage them. The VAR had already done so, adopting human psychological techniques for controlling aggressive dominance. The humans had adopted VAR traditions of honorable discharge and post-conflict reconciliation. The two most feared species in the galaxy were now the architects of a peace initiative. And then came the final surprise. During the press conference, a human journalist asked the question everyone was thinking. How do we know you'll never break the leash? What if some future human leader decides to fight at full strength? John Smith turned to the camera. He held up a small, translucent chip. This is the reason we never will. Embedded in the command structure of every nuclear-armed nation on Earth is a consensus lock. It's not controlled by a single person. It's not controlled by a government. It requires simultaneous approval from a randomly selected panel of ordinary citizens, vetted military ethicists, and representatives of our global culture. It's a leash with 1,000 locks. We built it because we know ourselves. We know that power corrupts, so we made the leash unbreakable from the inside. The only way it snaps is if someone outside forces us to defend ourselves in a way that overwhelms the lock. And that's why we're here, inviting you in. The more of you who join the Accord, the fewer outside threats we'll ever face, and the more secure the leash becomes. Our restraint is your guarantee, and we're offering you a chance to make it permanent. Kesh, in her final report, described the lock as a species-scale fail-safe, but she added a personal note that would echo through the corridors of the coalition for centuries. Humanity did not become peaceful. They became wise. They understood that a predator without a tether is a disaster waiting to happen. So they tethered themselves to one another, and now they're tethering themselves to us. They are not asking us to trust them. They are giving us the blueprint to lock the cage from the outside as well. And perhaps that's the scariest revelation of all. Humanity didn't conquer its demons. It learned their names, mapped their triggers, and built a civilization around keeping them fed just enough to never hunt. They still have claws. They still have fangs. They simply choose not to use them because they know the cost of letting go would be everything. The real question isn't whether the leash will hold. It's whether the rest of the galaxy can learn to live next door to a predator who has domesticated itself without ever being tamed. Because the only thing more terrifying than a species that has never fought at full strength is a species that knows exactly how strong it could be and still says no. That's the story of humanity. Not a race of beasts, but a race of beast tamers, and the beast is themselves. If this gave you a new way to think about human nature, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive into the stories that reframe everything we take for granted. Thanks for watching.